Our billionaire's reputation is burning, so he hires a quiet night janitor to fake an engagement. But when one photo goes viral, she becomes the headline, and the hunt for her real identity begins. Welcome to Sweet Chapters. Before we start, comment which city you're watching from. And when the story ends, rate it from 0 to 10 and tell us what you felt. If you love emotional romances with twists, hidden truths and second chances, follow Sweet Chapters so you don't miss the next chapter. At 2 in the morning, Nayeli Sosa moved through the building the way she always did, quietly and without expectation, pushing her cart from corridor to corridor as if she were part of the maintenance itself, rather than a person with a pulse and a history. She avoided mirrors, avoided security desks, avoided conversations that could turn into questions. Her badge had a borrowed name, her papers lived only in her pocket and in her fear, and every shift ended with the same private relief. She had survived another night unseen. That illusion shattered when she heard a voice ahead of her, sharp with entitlement, followed by another that grew smaller with every word. A temporary employee stood pressed near the wall, her shoulders hunched, while a senior executive leaned too close, speaking as if consequences were optional. Nayeli felt the old instinct rise, the one that told her to disappear. Instead, she stepped forward. She placed her cart aside and put herself directly between them, her body blocking his path, her eyes lifted despite the risk. "She said no," Nayeli said calmly, her accent thickening with emotion. The man laughed at first, then noticed the steadiness in her gaze. Anger replaced amusement, but humiliation followed when she refused to move. He backed away, cursing under his breath, just as footsteps approached from the far end of the hall. Eamon Kincaid arrived expecting inconvenience, not defiance. He had spent the night answering calls about the fire, about shareholders, about optics, his mind crowded with damage control and legal language. When he reached the hallway, he saw an image that did not fit his world. A cleaning woman standing like a barricade, hands shaking but unmoving, while one of his most powerful executives retreated with fury written across his face. The executive started explaining himself, but Eamon raised a hand, silencing him without effort. His attention stayed fixed on Nayeli. She did not apologize. She did not explain. She only stood there, breathing carefully, as if any wrong movement might collapse something fragile inside her. Chairman dismissed the executive with a clipped instruction to report to HR and leave the building immediately. When the hallway cleared, he turned back to Nayeli, noticing details he had never trained himself to see. The tension in her jaw, the way her fingers curled inward once the threat passed, the quiet resolve that lingered even when the moment was over. "You didn't have to do that," he said, not unkindly. Nayeli met his gaze and answered honestly, "Someone did." The simplicity of it unsettled him more than any accusation could have. For the first time that night, Eamon felt something shift that money could not smooth over. They spoke briefly then, only what was necessary. Nayeli insisted on returning to her work. Eamon watched her go, the image of her courage following him back into the storm of his life. Hours later, the news cycle caught up to him with brutal efficiency. The fire dominated every screen, his name stitched into blame and outrage, while his attorney reminded him that the guardianship hearing for his sister was days away. A morality clause loomed like a loaded weapon. Public instability, scandal, or questionable personal conduct could cost him Juniper. The board wanted reassurance, something visible and immediate, a stable image, a family man. Eamon sat alone in his office long after dawn, replaying the hallway scene in his mind, not because it was useful, but because it was real. By morning, he had made a decision that felt reckless even to him. He asked his assistant to find the cleaning woman from the night shift, the one who had stood her ground. When Nayeli was called into a conference room, her first instinct was fear. She sat across from him, back straight, ready to deny everything if needed. Eamon surprised her by thanking her first. Then he laid out his situation, his voice measured, his offer deliberate. The proposal sounded unreal even as it was spoken. A 30-day engagement, purely public, documented by contract. Appearances only. In exchange, he would fund top-tier legal representation for her immigration case, no strings hidden in fine print. Nayeli listened without interrupting. her thoughts racing faster than her expression allowed. She understood leverage, she understood danger. This was both. She asked careful questions, not about money, but about control, about exit terms, about what happened if the lie collapsed. Eamon answered honestly, admitting risk where it existed, refusing to dress it up as kindness. He expected her to refuse or to negotiate harder for security. Instead, she grew quiet. She thought of the sirens she flinched at, the nights she slept ready to run, the life lived in margins. She thought of the girl in the hallway, smaller than fear, and of the man across from her who had power but seemed hollowed by it. "This protects your sister," she said. Eamon nodded. "And me," she added softly. He nodded again. The silence stretched, heavy with consequence. Nayeli realized survival sometimes came disguised as compromise, and compromise as courage. Still, she would not be owned by the arrangement. She leaned forward then, placing her palms flat on the table, grounding herself. "I'll do it," she said, watching relief flicker across his face before she finished. "But not like that." Eamon stilled. Nayeli's voice did not rise, but it sharpened. She told him she would not be a prop used to clean his image, while the people hurt by his company remained invisible. She demanded that he show up, in person, to face the families displaced by the fire, the workers affected by decisions made in rooms like this one. No checks passed through lawyers, No statements written by consultants, presence, listening, accountability. Eamon tried to respond, instinctively reaching for strategy, but she stopped him with a look that echoed the hallway. "If you can't do that," she said, "then the contract means nothing." The audacity of it stunned him. No advisor would ever suggest such a condition, no employee would dare. Yet the truth in her demand stripped his defenses bare. After a long moment, Eamon nodded once, slow and deliberate. "I'll do it," he said. Nayeli held his gaze until she believed him. Only then did she accept the pen, signing her name with steady hands, stepping into danger with her eyes open, and into survival on her own terms. The next morning, the machinery of fabrication began like clockwork, without hesitation or warmth. Aria Belden, Eamon's senior assistant, had already transformed hotel scandals, board missteps, and tax discrepancies into polished footnotes. This was different, though. This was a person. Still, she moved quickly, reshaping Nayeli's existence like she was updating a marketing package. A stylist came first, her voice cheerful but impersonal, as she measured Nayeli's frame and made comments in rapid shorthand. "She has good cheekbones. Keep her hair off the face. Don't try to hide the nose, it gives character." Nayeli didn't flinch, but something inside her shrank. She tried not to react as a blazer was draped over her shoulders and gold hoops replaced her small silver studs. The ring came last, a modest classic diamond set in a thin band of platinum. Aria said it was just enough sparkle to be credible, but not too gaudy to raise eyebrows. Nayeli slipped it on, her fingers stiff, her skin colder than the metal. The diamond caught the light with merciless precision, and for a second it felt like everyone could see right through her. She nodded when asked if it fit. The ring wasn't tight, but the lie was already suffocating. During the media prep session, Nayeli sat through hours of coaching that felt more like erasure than instruction. Her consultant with 2 white teeth and a binder full of bullet points coached her on smiling softly but not passively, how to touch Eamon's arm in ways that looked unrehearsed, how to answer intrusive questions with charm and ambiguity. "Make people feel like they're learning something without you actually confirming anything," he advised, holding up a flashcard labeled "Safe Responses." Nayeli's jaw tensed as she repeated the lines. "We met through mutual friends. It happened faster than either of us expected. We're just really happy." She repeated them again and again until the syllables stopped meaning anything. When the consultant left, Eamon stayed behind, watching her silently. Finally, he spoke. "You don't have to say everything they tell you. I trust your instincts." It was the first time anyone in the building had used the word trust with her, and she didn't know how to carry it. "You sure about that?" she asked, one brow raised. "You barely know me." He didn't answer right away, only said, "You stood in front of someone you didn't owe anything to. That tells me more than most people I've known for years." She wanted to believe that, but her body still felt like it was being dressed for a part she didn't audition for. Later that afternoon, the first public outing was scheduled. A brief photo op outside one of Eamon's properties, timed for maximum visibility. They were told where to stand, how long to hold hands, even which direction to look when smiling. Eamon seemed used to the choreography. Nayeli felt like she was walking on strings. When he placed a hand lightly on her lower back, the gesture was professional, almost protective. But she caught a brief glance from a bystander, a woman in a dark coat who stared too long, and a cold panic rushed through Nayeli's chest. What if that woman knew her from somewhere? What if she recognized her name from an old job, a lease application, or something worse? The fear never fully left after that. She kept touching the ring unconsciously, not as a symbol of connection but as armor, something to distract, to redirect, to keep people from looking too closely at the woman behind the role. Eamon noticed. "How you keep doing that?" he murmured as they waited inside the car afterward. "What?" she asked. "The ring. You look at it like it might burn you." She turned her gaze to the window. "Because I don't forget, it's not mine." He said nothing, but she saw him nod faintly, as if conceding that it would never feel like his either. That evening, after the long hours of smiling, nodding, and playing a part that made her throat ache, Nayeli returned to the guest room in Eamon's penthouse, a space too immaculate to feel safe. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at her hands. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small scrap of paper torn from an old notebook. With a pen taken from the kitchen drawer, she wrote her real name, her full, given name, in tight, careful script. It wasn't for anyone else. It wasn't a confession or a declaration. It was a reminder. She folded it twice, then slipped it into the inside sole of her right shoe. The gesture was quiet, private, but it made her feel grounded in a way the tailored clothes and strategic smiles never could. No matter how deep the lie ran, no matter how many hands guided her posture or rehearsed her voice, that scrap of paper held something they couldn't reach. She didn't cry. Not yet. She only exhaled slowly, like someone preparing for a long journey in someone else's name. In that moment, she wasn't wearing Eamon's fiancé's face. She was Nayeli again, undocumented, unseen, unclaimed, and fiercely, stubbornly real. Later that night, Eamon called her into his office. The contract had arrived from legal, printed neatly in a binder that smelled faintly of new ink. He handed it to her with a calm expression, but there was a tightness in his posture that hadn't been there earlier. "It covers everything we discussed," he said. "Dates, terms, exit clauses, confidentiality. Your legal representation is arranged, one of the best in the state." She flipped through the pages, absorbing the cold finality of the words. Everything was there, itemized and clear. 30 days. Public appearances. Mutual consent to terminate early if trust was breached. She signed it slowly, her hand steady. When she looked up, he was already extending a small card toward her, the name of the immigration lawyer embossed in crisp silver font. As she reached to take it, their fingers brushed for a second too long. Eamon looked at her then, really looked, and in his eyes she saw something that didn't match the control in his voice. Not guilt, exactly. Not pity either. It was something like awareness, as if he had only just begun to realize the weight of what they were doing, and who it was costing more. Nayeli took the card and stepped back. She didn't thank him. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because she couldn't afford to pretend that this transaction was generosity. He didn't speak again. She left the room with the contract in hand, the ring still burning on her finger, and the knowledge that tomorrow the performance would begin in full. In the silence of the hallway leading back to her room, Nayeli paused by a tall mirror near the staircase. She turned slowly, letting her gaze rest on her reflection. Her hair had been straightened, her coat cinched at the waist, her shoes polished to reflect light. She looked like someone who belonged at Eamon Kincaid's side, someone crafted, someone safe. But her eyes betrayed the truth. Tired, sharp, full of questions no one had answered. In the mirror, Eamon appeared behind her, stepping from his office, but neither of them spoke. They met eyes through the glass. The stillness stretched between them. Two people tied together by necessity, not trust. Two strangers holding the same lie for very different reasons. He gave her the smallest nod before turning away. She watched him go, then faced herself again. pressing her thumb against the ring until the skin beneath it turned white. There would be cameras, interviews, smiles. But tonight, she tucked herself into bed with a paper talisman in her shoe and a mind too full to rest. The lie had been built. The ring was on. Tomorrow the world would start believing it, and Nayeli would have to keep pretending she didn't hate that a part of her already had. Eamon had anticipated a boardroom, or at the very least a neutral office, with a carafe of coffee and chairs set at the perfect angle for negotiation. That was what community outreach usually meant to people like him. Staged concern, controlled dialogue, a press release at the end with enough sincerity to pacify the press. So when Nayeli told him to meet her outside a Lutheran church on the south side of the city, he assumed she had misunderstood the request. "This isn't optics," she said, climbing into his car without waiting for permission. "It's people." Eamon glanced at her, frowning. "We're not here to make you a hero," she added flatly. "We're here so you can see what your money won't fix." He didn't answer. Instead, he looked out the window, adjusting the cuff of his tailored coat as if it could shield him from the collision he now saw coming. Inside the basement, the air was thick with everything money could not erase: weariness, betrayal, and the heat of grief wrapped in donated jackets. Folding chairs were scattered, soup served from a crock-pot at the back, and no one stood to shake his hand. They didn't even look surprised to see him. Only tired, only waiting. The introductions were quick. Nayeli called him by name, not title, not Mr. Kincaid. That alone disarmed him. Then she stepped back and let the silence close in. An older woman with worn hands spoke first. She had lost her apartment in the fire, and her son now had a cough that didn't go away. "We were told the building had passed inspection," she said, voice trembling, "but the alarms didn't go off." Eamon said nothing. Another man stood, a mechanic who now slept in his car. "I don't need your apology," he said, staring directly at Eamon. "I need to stop waking up cold." One by one they told their stories, without drama, without pleading, just facts laid out like broken bones on a table. Nayeli stayed close to the edge of the room, letting them speak. She didn't intervene, didn't soften the blow. She looked at Eamon only once, when a young girl asked if the people in suits had homes that caught fire too. He didn't flinch, but he couldn't meet her eyes. When a mother broke down mid-sentence, clutching a crumpled eviction notice in her hands, Eamon finally sat down. Not because he was invited to, because standing felt dishonest. It wasn't that he didn't know loss existed. Of course he did. His spreadsheets were full of impact reports, damage claims, adjusted settlements. But what he saw that night wasn't data. It was dignity held together by exhaustion. It was pain uncontained by legal language. It was the unspoken truth that they had stopped believing anyone would fix this. That night, his role as benefactor became a weight he couldn't shift with posture or policy. One woman asked him softly if his company would rebuild the housing. He didn't answer. He didn't know. Another man, a retired janitor with a limp and a rusted wedding ring, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Just show up again," he said. "Don't just come once." And that broke something. Because the truth was, Eamon hadn't planned to come at all. Only Nayeli had insisted. As the vigil ended, and people folded their chairs and pulled on mismatched gloves, Eamon lingered in the corner of the room, suddenly ashamed of the way he had prepared for this evening like it was a press briefing. Nayeli, standing near the back exit, watched him with an expression he couldn't read. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't pity, it was something quieter, maybe respect, maybe warning. Outside, the wind bit at their faces, but neither spoke. Snow was falling steadily, painting the street in soft grey. The last of the candles from the vigil flickered behind stained glass windows, casting colour over the frozen sidewalk. Nayeli stood beneath a crooked streetlight, breath visible in slow, deliberate clouds. Her arms were crossed, her shoulders hunched, not from the cold, but from everything else. Eamon approached without a word. She didn't look at him. For a long moment, they stood there, two people from irreconcilable worlds, bound by a lie that had taken on a life of its own. Then, without thinking, Eamon reached up and unwrapped the scarf from his neck, stepping forward to place it gently around hers. The motion was fluid, almost tender, a gesture without calculation. Nayeli froze, startled. She opened her mouth to protest, but something in his face stopped her. Not arrogance, not performance. Just an unspoken offering of warmth he didn't know how to express with words. Her fingers clutched the edge of the scarf, more out of instinct than acceptance. She still didn't look at him, not fully, but she didn't remove it either. The flash came fast. Across the street, someone stood with a phone raised. The sharp sound of the shutter cutting through the stillness. The light hit them both, catching the exact second his hand lingered near her cheek, the scarf half-tied, the distance between them minimal. They weren't touching like lovers, but they weren't not touching either. The picture would tell its own story, it always did. The photographer lowered the phone and vanished before either of them could react. Nayeli stepped back immediately, her eyes wide with something between panic and fury. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice low. "The scarf or the whatever that just was." Eamon looked at her, expression unreadable. "I wasn't thinking," he admitted. "That's the problem," she snapped. "They are." She gestured toward the now empty street. "They always are." She turned away before he could speak again. For the rest of the walk back to the car, silence settled between them like a punishment. The image had been captured. The illusion, now public. By morning it was everywhere. News blogs, gossip columns, even legitimate outlets, all spinning the narrative they'd been starving for. Kincaid's secret fiancé read one headline, plastered beneath the photo of them beneath the streetlight. The scarf, the proximity, the look on both their faces. None of it subtle enough to deny. Nayeli's phone vibrated non-stop. Notifications from numbers she didn't recognize, messages asking about wedding dates, former co-workers sending wide-eyed emojis, and one voicemail from a woman she hadn't spoken to in years, just whispering, "Be careful." She didn't answer any of it. She sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing the scarf, staring at the screen until the notifications blurred. Her anonymity, the thing she'd clung to her entire life, was dissolving faster than she could control. She wasn't afraid of being seen. She was afraid of being seen wrong. And for the first time since she'd come to America, Nayeli realized being invisible had been its own kind of safety. Now, with her face viral and her name just one headline away from discovery, she was more than visible. She was exposed. Fame didn't arrive with applause or congratulations. It came with flashbulbs, whispers, and the suffocating feeling that every step was being watched. Within 24 hours of the photo's release, Nayeli's face was everywhere. Not just in newspapers and digital headlines, but in casual gossip and social media sleuth threads. People zoomed into the photo, analyzing her earrings, the brand of her coat, the distance between her and Eamon. Her invented name, chosen carefully to avoid attention, was now a trending search term. She saw her face in screenshots, her gestures interpreted as everything from seduction to manipulation. Strangers filmed her in grocery aisles, asked if she was the fiancée, and when she ignored them, they called her rude. The attention felt violent, but the worst part wasn't the noise. It was the feeling that she was no longer allowed to exist without justification. Every smile was dissected, every word evaluated, and beneath all the commentary was the same question repeated like a curse. Who is she, really? Nayeli realized then that disappearing had once been her only power, and now it was gone. At the Kincaid corporate offices, the boardroom seethed with tension. Eamon's directors weren't outraged because he lied. Lies were part of their vocabulary. They were furious because he'd lost control of the lie. "You handed them a narrative without guardrails," one of them hissed, throwing a tabloid across the table. "She's not vetted. She's not even from here." The word "here" carried weight. Country, class, world. Eamon, unshaken on the surface, replied that Nayeli's background was her business, not theirs. That only enraged them more. Into this storm stepped Selene Ward, an heiress turned socialite with philanthropic credentials built more on branding than service. She arrived at a foundation gala uninvited and approached Nayeli like they were childhood friends. "You're so brave," Selene said, her smile tight and perfectly lipsticked. "I love that you're just natural, real." Her voice dripped condescension so sweet it sounded like admiration. Then she leaned closer and whispered, "Don't get too comfortable. They always choose their own." Nayeli said nothing, but when Eamon approached, Celine immediately wrapped her arm around Nayeli's and posed like they were a united front. The photo of them together went viral hours later. High society backs the fiancé, and Celine achieved exactly what she wanted: proximity to chaos, dressed as generosity. Meanwhile, a new predator began circling from a different angle. Dashiell Roan, known in journalistic circles as Dash the Scalpel, had started his own investigation. He didn't believe in accidents or coincidences, and the moment he saw the scarf photo, he smelled blood. He began making calls to city records, to hospital staff, to tenants of the burned building. His questions were always polite, but sharp. Who was the woman in the picture? When did she and Eamon meet? Did anyone have her name before last week? Nayeli could feel his approach like static in the air. He hadn't contacted her directly yet, but she saw unfamiliar cars parked outside her building. Once she left work to find a folded note under her windshield wiper. "You can either tell your story or let someone else tell it for you." Eamon responded by assigning private security and offering to move her temporarily, but she refused. "I've been hiding my whole life," she said. "I'm not hiding for your company." Still, she couldn't stop checking over her shoulder. She started using back entrances, changing routines. The world had become smaller, tighter. Fame wasn't a stage, it was a trapdoor. Everything changed the night her apartment's heating system failed. The pipes groaned, then fell silent, and within hours the cold began to seep through the walls. She tried wrapping herself in layers, boiling water to generate warmth, even lighting a candle. But it wasn't enough. Her landlord didn't answer the phone. When she told Eamon, expecting indifference, he didn't hesitate. "You're coming with me," he said. "People are watching," she reminded him. "All the more reason to keep up the illusion," he said, but his voice lacked its usual edge. He picked her up in person and drove in silence. When they entered his penthouse, the contrast hit her like a slap. Everything too perfect, too curated. She walked barefoot on the heated floor, marveling at the absurdity of luxury, while picturing her mother's cracked hands soaking clothes in a plastic basin. In the guest room, she unpacked slowly, feeling like she was touching someone else's life. The space was beautiful, but soulless. No clutter, no warmth, just expensive furniture arranged by someone who'd never had to live with imperfection. That night, sleep came late and fitful. She drifted between memories and fears, her body trapped in the halfway space between survival and suspicion. Sometime after 3 a.m., she woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The dream had been vivid. ICE agents banging on the door, her mother's voice calling from far away, the sound of footsteps echoing down an endless hallway. She rose, her breath short, and wandered to the kitchen. She poured hot water into a mug and clutched it like a weapon, standing still, heart racing. That was how Eamon found her. He didn't speak at first, only paused in the doorway, then stepped into the room like someone entering a sacred space. His gaze landed on her hands. "Bad dream?" he asked softly. She didn't answer right away. "Worse than that," she whispered. "It was memory." He didn't move closer, didn't try to comfort her with touch. He simply leaned against the counter, hands in his pockets, and stayed. Present, awake, breathing, not demanding anything from her. They stood in silence for several minutes, the kind that didn't require words. Eventually her shoulders dropped, her grip on the mug loosened, her breathing steadied. And though nothing had been said to change their circumstance, something had shifted between them, something small and real, fragile as frost, but alive. By morning, the world had not slowed its spin. Reporters still camped outside the building. Threads about her identity still bloomed online. Dash Roan was still closing in. Celine Ward was still smiling too wide. But in that kitchen at that hour, something had formed that hadn't existed before. A kind of trust built not on promises, but on presence. Nayeli returned to her guest room with no illusions about safety, but with the sense that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in the performance anymore. And Eamon, watching her go, felt the unfamiliar ache of something more dangerous than exposure: connection. The kind you couldn't script, manage, or erase. The kind that crept in like warmth through a crack in the wall and refused to leave. Living together, even under a lie, slowly changed the air between Nayeli and Eamon. What began as an arrangement wrapped in strategy became something more dangerous, routine. It happened in quiet ways, the kind no contract could anticipate. Nayeli noticed the way Eamon double-checked every lock before bed, as if safety could only exist through ritual. He would pause at the front door, retrace his steps, and test the handle twice more before the lights went out. She said nothing the first few nights. Then one evening, when he moved toward the lock for the third time, she murmured, "Do you think someone's coming, or do you just always feel like they might?" He paused but didn't turn. "Both," he said simply. It was the kind of answer that needed no follow-up. In turn, he learned her habits too, how she folded towels with military corners, her brow furrowed in concentration like it mattered to someone else. She counted her coins in a glass jar every Friday, eyes tense, breath shallow. She told him once that poverty wasn't a state. It was a memory you could never stop preparing for. He didn't correct her. He just started leaving spare change on the counter, without comment, where she could take it without asking. Eamon watched her in the kitchen one morning, where she moved like she was reclaiming territory. She stirred eggs with a wooden spoon that had clearly been used too many times, muttering in Spanish when the pan sizzled too quickly. When she burned them again, she cursed, not at the food, but at herself. "Estúpido, ¿cómo se me va otra vez?" she whispered, mostly to herself. Eamon chuckled without meaning to. She turned, eyes narrowed. "You laughing at me?" she said, half teasing. He held up his hands. "Not at you. Just, I don't think I've heard someone speak 3 languages in one sentence before breakfast." She rolled her eyes, but her mouth twitched upward. That was the first time he laughed without planning it. The sound startled them both. The silence after was oddly gentle. She plated the eggs anyway, burned edges and all, and placed them in front of him with mock dignity. "Eat like a poor person, Mr. Kincaid." "I grew up on cereal bars," he replied, grabbing a fork. She smirked, but her expression softened when he ate every bite without complaint. It wasn't romance. Not yet, but it was something human, which, in their world of carefully constructed lies, felt more valuable than love. The immigration process began soon after. It was paperwork at first. Dense, soul-draining forms filled with questions designed to turn a life into boxes checked and dates remembered. Fingerprints, photographs, evidence of presence, evidence of decency. Nayeli sat at the table with documents spread around her like battlefield debris, her hands trembling as she tried to recall addresses she had forced herself to forget. Eamon offered to have his legal team help. She refused. "I'll talk to your lawyer. But this part, I do myself." She didn't explain why. He didn't ask. Still, he paid for the filing fees, the translations, the affidavits. She told herself it was part of the arrangement, and maybe it was. But she cleaned every inch of the penthouse in return. Not because he asked, not because she needed to, but because it reminded her who she was. It grounded her. There was something sacred in scrubbing tile with her own hands, something real in folding the laundry, even if it had already been folded. Once, he tried to stop her. "You don't have to do this," he said. She looked at him and replied, "If I stop doing things that make me feel useful, I'll forget I'm allowed to be here." He nodded and never brought it up again. One night, when Eamon was out taking a call on the balcony, Nayeli wandered into his office to leave a file. She wasn't snooping, that's what she told herself. But something on the desk caught her attention, a framed photo, slightly askew, buried behind a stack of paperwork. It was a girl no older than 15, with guarded eyes and a reluctant smile. Her hair was wild, her posture defiant. She looked like someone who'd learned early that softness was dangerous. Nayeli picked it up slowly, brushing a thumb across the glass. The frame was scuffed at the edges, as if it had been carried through too many moves. Before she could set it down, Eamon appeared in the doorway. His voice was quiet, but his body had gone still. "That's Juniper," he said. "My sister." Nayeli didn't apologize. She set the photo back with care, aligning it exactly how she'd found it. "She looks like she knows how to fight," she said. Eamon didn't smile. He walked past her, sat behind the desk, and stared at the photo for a long moment. Then he said, "When our mother died, I told her I'd keep Juniper safe. That was the last promise I made that I actually meant." There was no flourish in his voice, no drama, just the raw edges of a vow he carried like a spine. Nayeli could have said many things. She could have offered sympathy or comfort, but she knew those things were for people who hadn't yet learned to carry pain like routine. So instead, she said, "That kind of promise changes you." Eamon looked up at her, not with gratitude but with recognition, like he understood that she wasn't speaking as an outsider, like she had promises of her own that had reshaped the way she walked through the world. There was a long silence between them. Then he said, "She's coming soon. The court wants to evaluate the living situation." Nayeli nodded. "I'll make sure the guest room is clean." "It's not your job." "I know," she said, "but I want her to see this place isn't just money and stone." He didn't argue. For once, he let her care for something without needing to justify it. That moment, quiet, shared, unfinished, settled into the space between them like a warm breath against glass. Later that night, after the lights were off and the doors locked, Eamon passed by the hallway leading to Nayeli's room. He paused for a moment, hearing nothing on the other side. She was probably asleep. Still, he stood there longer than necessary, hand half raised, not to knock, but just to be close. In her room, Nayeli lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She wasn't afraid. Not in the same way anymore. The fear now was subtler, more dangerous. It came in the form of softness, of quiet moments that felt like truth, of shared laughter over burned eggs, of glances that lasted longer than they should. She turned on her side, clutching a pillow, and let her breath slow. Somewhere in the penthouse, Eamon finally stepped away from her door. Neither of them said a word that night, but something had settled between them, something fragile and unspoken, a thread not yet pulled, a confession not yet made, but waiting. And for now, that was enough. Juniper arrived without warning, storming into the penthouse like a dare wrapped in denim and sarcasm. The social worker trailed behind her, clipboard in hand, already exhausted by the girl's sharp tongue and sharper silences. Eamon was in the middle of a call when the elevator chimed, and he stepped out of his office, only to freeze at the sight of his younger sister standing in the doorway like she was ready to set the place on fire just by breathing in it. 16, scowling and utterly unimpressed, Juniper surveyed the immaculate space with a glare that seemed to scream, "This isn't real." Then her eyes landed on Nayeli. The scorn was instant. "So this is the fiancé," she muttered, her tone dripping with the same venom reserved for school principals and court-appointed therapists. Nayeli, seated at the kitchen island with a book half open and a mug in hand, looked up slowly. She didn't smile. She didn't rush to defend herself or soften the blow. Instead, she stood, walked to the counter and poured hot chocolate into a clean mug. "You want this or not?" she asked plainly. Juniper narrowed her eyes, but took the cup. It was a standoff between two women who recognized that kindness without authenticity was just another form of control. The social worker spent the next hour inspecting everything, asking Eamon about schooling plans, safety protocols, emotional readiness, legal preparations. Juniper answered only when forced, and even then, her responses were clipped and barbed. When asked how she felt about potentially living here, she shrugged and said, "Better than a shelter, worse than hell." The woman scribbled something on her clipboard, clearly noting non-compliant attitude. Nayeli remained on the sidelines, not speaking unless spoken to. But she watched. She noticed the way Juniper's eyes flicked toward her every time Eamon looked her way. The girl was studying him, measuring the shifts in his expression when Nayeli moved, when she laughed, when she touched his arm lightly, in the way they'd been trained to do in public. Juniper didn't trust easily, but worse, she could see through performance. And what unsettled her more than anything was that Eamon, for all his stiffness and practiced detachment, softened around Nayeli in ways he clearly didn't even notice. His posture leaned in. His eyes followed. It was subtle but real. Juniper saw it and hated it, not because she disliked Nayeli, not yet, but because it made the entire narrative more confusing. Lies she could handle. Feelings were messy. When the social worker finally left, giving Eamon a tight nod and muttering something about follow-up visits, the air didn't relax. If anything, it thickened. Juniper tossed her bag on the couch and turned to Nayeli with a calculated expression. "So," she said, arms crossed, "how much is he paying you?" The question wasn't shouted. It was sharp, quiet, weaponized, the kind of thing meant to cut beneath the skin. Nayeli didn't flinch. She set her mug down, stepped closer, and answered with the same even calm she'd used in the hallway that night with the executive. "There's a contract," she said. "It's real, but not everything that matters is in writing." Juniper rolled her eyes so hard it looked painful. "Spare me the poetic crap." "I'm not being poetic," Nayeli replied. "I'm being honest." For a moment, Juniper seemed thrown. She didn't expect honesty. She expected defensiveness, anger, maybe guilt. But Nayeli simply stood her ground, not explaining further, not retreating. It was the kind of answer that didn't demand belief. It just refused to lie. Juniper shook her head and walked away, muttering something unintelligible, but the challenge in her eyes was quieter now, almost thoughtful. Like maybe, just maybe, she didn't know what to make of this woman after all. That night, Juniper stayed in the guest room furthest from everyone else. She didn't come to dinner. She didn't respond when Eamon knocked. But Nayeli, passing by later, heard the music playing softly through the door. A playlist of 90s alt-rock that sounded far too familiar for someone Juniper's age. It reminded her of a girl trying to build walls tall enough to be mistaken for strength. She didn't interrupt. She didn't try to connect, but she left a folded blanket just outside the door and a note with Wi-Fi instructions. Plus, "The fridge is always open, even at midnight." The paper was gone the next morning. No thank you followed. Still, it mattered. At around 11:30 p.m., Eamon retreated to his office. Nayeli passed by on her way to the laundry room and heard him speaking, not formally, not controlled. His voice was breaking. She stopped, frozen by the sound of him saying, "If they find any flaw, they'll take her. One mistake and she's gone." "I don't know if I can fix this again," his lawyer responded, muffled and logical. Nayeli couldn't make out the words, but she didn't need to. The grief in Eamon's voice carried the truth more clearly than any sentence. In the guest room, Juniper heard it too. She had one earbud in, but the other ear picked up the emotion through the walls. She sat up slowly in bed, the book she'd been pretending to read slipping off her lap. Her brother didn't cry, not even when their mother died, not at the foster hearings, not at court. But now his voice cracked like glass under pressure, and she realized he wasn't afraid of losing a case. He was afraid of losing her. That truth hit her harder than she wanted to admit. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms tight around them, swallowing tears that had no name. Then a soft sound interrupted her spiraling thoughts, the almost inaudible scratch of paper sliding against the floor. She turned toward the door. A note had been slipped underneath. It was folded in half, simple, unadorned. Juniper picked it up, unfolded it, and read, "You don't have to choose between being tough and being loved." The handwriting was neat, careful, intentional. She stared at it for a long time, then folded it back, slower this time. She opened her nightstand, hesitated, then changed her mind. She slid the note into the case of her phone, the one thing she always kept with her. And though she didn't smile, her eyes softened in the dark, like something had finally cracked, just a little. It was past 10 when Nayeli padded softly down the hallway, laundry basket in her arms, balancing a stack of towels and Eamon's perfectly ironed shirts. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She never did. But the door to Eamon's office was slightly ajar, and the sound of her name, even in its absence, pulled her gaze inward like a reflex. She paused, uncertain, her body half turned toward her room, her mind unable to let go of the low timbre of Eamon's voice. It wasn't the voice she knew from the kitchen or the quiet moments between them. This was his executive voice, the one that carved distance between people and problems. He spoke calmly, as if giving quarterly projections. "The engagement has stabilized our numbers," he said. Public sentiment turned around once she appeared. "She's been effective. Her story plays well." The words struck with surgical precision, slicing through something Nayeli hadn't realized was exposed. Effective. Plays well. Like a slogan. Like a brand. She wasn't a person in that moment. She was a device, a narrative choice. The lawyer responded, tone smooth and practical. "Then once the hearing's over, you can cut ties clean, before immigration flags anything. It's the smart thing." Eamon didn't interrupt. Not quickly, not loudly. He just hesitated. In that pause, everything inside Nayeli stilled. Her arms clutched the basket closer to her chest as if that might hold her together. She didn't hear what came after. Maybe Eamon defended her, maybe not. But the damage was done. That brief, brutal moment of silence confirmed what her fear had always whispered. That people like her were only ever temporary, useful, until they weren't. It wasn't rage that filled her. It was recognition. Familiar, cold, and cruel. The same feeling she'd had when her landlord forgot to repair the heat. When an employer said she was overqualified after finding out her status. When her mother got sick and no clinic would touch them. She moved again, quietly, deliberately. There was no point in drama, no time for confrontation. This wasn't a betrayal she could fight. It was one she could only endure. She walked past the door like she hadn't heard a word, entered her room, and set the laundry down with methodical grace. Her hands didn't shake. She folded the shirts one by one, crisp edges, perfect creases. Then she opened the closet and pulled out the small duffel bag she kept tucked beneath her bed, the one that always had to be ready. She packed fast, not panicked but precise. A change of clothes, 2 envelopes of saved cash, a copy of her legal paperwork, and the note with her real name, the one she kept hidden in her shoe. She took nothing he'd given her. Not the coat, not the jewelry, not even the toothbrush with the gold initials stamped on the handle. The apartment was still, the city sleeping far below, but inside her chest everything buzzed with a kind of exhausted grief. She moved to the kitchen last, the ring on her finger now foreign and hot. She slid it off and placed it beside the fruit bowl. Not hidden, not dramatic, just visible enough to be undeniable. Then she scribbled on a sticky note with a pen that barely worked. Her handwriting was steady, but the ink threatened to give out. "I was trying to believe you saw me," she wrote. That was all. No accusations, no pleas, no bitterness. Just the quiet confession of someone who had let herself hope and now understood the price of that mistake. She placed the note beside the ring, aligning them like pieces on a chessboard she had chosen to leave behind. By the time Eamon stepped out of his office, whether to get water or look for her or simply to breathe, she was already gone. No slammed doors, no trace of movement. Just her absence, echoing through the penthouse like something sacred had been misplaced. He paused when he saw the ring, eyes narrowing, then reading the note beside it. His expression didn't crumble immediately. It hardened first, the way a man's face does when he realizes he's bleeding but hasn't felt it yet. He called her name once, then again. No answer. He checked her room. The closet door hung open slightly, and the duffel was missing. Her toothbrush gone, her drawer empty. The realization hit like a delayed explosion. "God damn it," he muttered, gripping the kitchen counter. He didn't call security. He didn't alert the board. What would he even say? That the woman whose story he used had finally remembered her own. That the person he'd treated like a placeholder had been the only real thing in his world of projections and scripts. Meanwhile, Nayeli slipped into the night like she'd never been there. She didn't cry as she left the building, her ID badge still tucked in her coat pocket, her shoes quiet on the pavement. Minneapolis stretched before her, cold, indifferent, wide, but she didn't flinch. She had disappeared before. She knew how. Her feet carried her toward nowhere in particular, just away from everything. She didn't look back. Looking back was for people who had something they could reclaim. For Nayeli, survival was forward motion. She blended into the city like water into soil, each step measured, each breath rehearsed. The headlines might keep spinning. The lawyers might keep debating. But she would vanish, because that's what she had always been trained to do. And this time, she didn't need anyone to open a door. She'd already found the exit. Eamon sat on the edge of the couch, the ring still in his hand, the note resting on his knee. The lawyer had long gone, and the silence in the room was unbearable. For the first time, he saw her absence, not as a problem to solve, but as a mirror held to his face. She had believed, and for a moment, that he saw her. And he had. But too late. Not loud enough, not clearly enough. The contract hadn't broken her, the silence had. And now she was gone. Not because she wanted to disappear, but because she'd always known that one day she might have to. And she hadn't waited for permission. She never had. Eamon searched like a man unraveling, one call after another. his voice growing hoarser with each dead end. He called shelters, every church he'd ever donated to, even hospitals, clinging to the fragile hope that somewhere, someone had seen her. Arya fielded media inquiries and scanned every surveillance camera within 5 miles of his penthouse. But Nayeli had vanished the way only someone with years of practice could, without a ripple. Every contact his wealth had ever bought him gave the same answer: nothing. And that, more than anything, made him realize how little power money held over someone like her. She didn't leave breadcrumbs. She didn't wait to be found. She knew how to disappear because the world had taught her from birth that safety was not something given. It was something stolen in small, silent pieces. Eamon hadn't slept in 2 nights. He kept the ring in his pocket, touching it absently like it might summon her. But the truth he now carried gnawed at him. He hadn't lost her because she ran. He'd lost her because when she needed him to speak, he hadn't. Not fast enough. Not like he meant it. And now the silence was permanent. While Eamon clawed through his guilt, Dash Roan's investigation was closing in like a wolf pack sensing blood. Dash had always been good at following half-truths, and the Kincaid engagement smelled off from the beginning. What tipped everything was a building source from inside the Kincaid security team. Someone with access to internal documents, someone who had seen a file not meant to exist. A whisper of Nayeli's undocumented status, enough to raise red flags with Dash's editor, who practically salivated at the idea of taking down the mighty Eamon Kincaid with a scandal. The angle was irresistible. Billionaire exploits undocumented woman for public redemption. Celeste Ward, ever the opportunist, fanned the flames under the guise of concern. She appeared on a morning show claiming she hoped the couple was okay, but expressed worry about integrity and the legal risk for all involved. Every word she said was measured, but every subtext screamed accusation. It wasn't a smear campaign. It was a surgical dismantling. They didn't need to prove anything. They just needed the rumor to hit at the right time. And with the guardianship hearing looming, the timing couldn't be worse. Nayeli, meanwhile, was hiding beneath the city that had made her both brave and invisible. She slept in the basement of the same church that had once held candles and survivors and grief. Now it held her. She didn't ask for help. She didn't even give her name. The pastor recognized her, didn't press, just left warm blankets and food by the stairs. She listened to the hum of pipes at night, her body curled beneath coats, trying to slow her racing thoughts. Part of her wanted to flee, to cross state lines, change her name again, become someone new in a different city. But every time she started to plan her exit, something inside her clenched. Then one morning, she saw a news segment on a dusty church television. The guardianship hearing was making headlines. Juniper's face blurred out, but the language was brutal. Unstable household, fraudulent engagement, potential risk to minor. Nayeli froze. She thought of Juniper's voice at the door, the reluctant trust in her eyes. She thought of the note she'd left her, folded and hidden like a secret. She thought of Eamon's scarf on that snowy night, the instinctive warmth in his hands. Love didn't always come with safety. Sometimes it came with responsibility. The next morning she didn't run. She stood. Her body trembled as she boarded the train downtown, but her resolve had settled. She didn't return to the penthouse. She didn't go to Eamon. She went to Dash. She walked into his newsroom unannounced, wearing borrowed clothes, dark circles under her eyes and steel in her spine. His assistant tried to stop her. She didn't budge. "I know what you're writing," she said when she reached his desk. Dash looked up, surprised but intrigued. "You here to deny it?" "No," she said. "I'm here to shape it." He leaned back, calculating. "Go on." She sat down, exhaled, and began. She told him about the fire, about the contract, about the lies and the truths buried beneath them. "Yes, I was undocumented. Yes, the engagement started as a deal," she said. "But that's not all it became. And if you're going to destroy me, you're going to do it with my voice in the story." Dash, to his credit, didn't interrupt. He recorded. He listened. And for once, Nayeli didn't feel like a target. She felt like a witness. When she was done, she looked him in the eye. "I'm not asking for mercy, just accuracy." The interview lasted over an hour. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She didn't ask to be painted as a victim or a hero. She told him about what it felt like to disappear, what it cost to stay, what it meant to be useful, then discarded. But she also spoke about Juniper, about the way Eamon held fear in his body without showing it. She described the moment she realized she could leave and chose not to, until she had no other choice. Dash nodded slowly, scribbling in his notebook, silent for once. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "Neither are you," she replied. She left the newsroom with nothing but a metro pass in her pocket, but her heart felt steadier. For the first time, she had chosen to be seen, not branded, not controlled, just seen. Whatever came next, deportation, humiliation, more headlines, would at least be born of her truth, not someone else's interpretation of it. And that, for someone like Nayeli, was a kind of power she had never been allowed to own. As she stepped out into the cold, the city buzzing around her, Nayeli didn't feel free, not yet, but she no longer felt hunted. She had handed her truth to the machine that could have chewed her up, and she had done it with her own words, her own terms. Inside the newsroom, Dash read over his notes again, slower this time. He scratched out the first paragraph of his draft, rewrote it, changed the headline. The article wouldn't be what the editor wanted. It wouldn't be scandal. It would be something harder to dismiss, something human. And for once, the story wouldn't just belong to the powerful. It would belong to the girl who refused to vanish. The courthouse was already swarming by the time Eamon stepped from the black car, lawyers flanking him like armored guards. Microphones were everywhere, cameras pointed at his face like weapons, their flashes relentless. The hearing was minutes away, and he wore the mask they expected, composed, expensive, unreadable. The press hurled questions as if daring him to blink. "Are you still claiming the engagement is real? Where is she? Will the court remove custody?" Eamon ignored them, his jaw locked in that same quiet tension that had carried him through boardrooms and funerals alike. But inside, he was unraveling. Every second without Nayeli was a confirmation of failure. She had left because he hadn't defended her in the moment that counted. And now, with Juniper's future on the line and his empire balancing on a knife's edge, he stood alone. Until the noise shifted. The crowd gasped, not collectively, but in waves, like wind rustling through disbelief. Reporters turned, phones raised. And there she was, walking slowly toward them like a living contradiction. No makeup, no curated outfit, no handlers. Just Nayeli, unguarded, unadorned, walking into the crosshairs like someone confessing to the world without asking permission. Dash Roan, standing in the second row, lowered his camera for a split second before lifting it again with shaking hands. For the first time, he didn't look predatory. He looked stunned. Nayeli's steps were steady, but her fingers curled tightly around the edges of her coat, her breath visible in the cold air. A reporter shoved a mic toward her. She didn't flinch. Instead, she took it with quiet authority. No nod to Eamon. No preamble. Just her voice, raw and steady. "Yes, it started as a contract." A gasp rippled through the media wall. She continued, louder now. "Yes, I'm undocumented, and yes, I agreed to lie, because I was afraid. Because survival sometimes means choosing the least terrible option." She paused, her eyes flicking toward the courthouse doors, then back to the crowd. But somewhere in the middle of that lie, something real began to grow, not clean, not simple, but real. "And I didn't run away because I was afraid of being caught. I ran because I was afraid of becoming a story that wasn't mine." Her voice cracked on the last word, and the microphone trembled in her grip. The crowd turned mean fast, as crowds do, from whispers to shouts, from questions to accusations. "Fraud!" someone yelled. "Deport her!" another added louder. The energy turned hostile in seconds. A second reporter stepped forward to ask whether she falsified immigration records. Before she could answer, Eamon's attorney surged forward, hand raised, ready to shut it all down. "This is not a media forum," he began, but was cut off by something no one expected. Eamon moved. He stepped past his lawyers, past the cameras, and walked to Nayeli's side. Not with the distant posture of a man salvaging PR, not with the panicked look of a cornered executive. He moved like someone shedding armor. He took the microphone from her hand with fingers that trembled slightly, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "She's telling the truth," he said. "All of it." Silence fell. He let it linger. I asked her to pretend. I needed the lie. I created it. Then his voice softened. But she was never a lie. She showed up when no one else would. She stood between people and harm. She walked into rooms I was too afraid to face. His hand found her elbow, not possessive, just steady. The only fraud here is the idea that I could buy redemption instead of earning it. The reporters were frozen. Even the shouting had stopped, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the rest of the act. But Eamon wasn't performing anymore. He looked directly into the cameras and delivered the final blow to the illusion that had kept his world intact. "If anyone needs to be punished," he said, voice shaking but unrelenting, "punish me, not her. I'm the one who built the lie. She only gave it heart." The words hit harder than any denial ever could have. The microphones caught everything. The broadcast went live within seconds. But none of that mattered in the moment, because Nayeli turned to look at him, really look, and something in her eyes flickered. Shock, pain, but beneath it, something deeper. A kind of fragile, aching hope. The kind that comes not from hearing the words you wanted, but from realizing they were finally said when it mattered. Not in private, not as an apology, but in front of the whole world. From the courthouse window, Juniper watched. Her fingers, pressed against the glass, left soft smudges on the surface. She had heard the rumors, seen the headlines, scrolled through the hate. She hadn't said a word all morning. But now, watching her brother, she saw something she had never seen before. Not in foster interviews, not in courtroom meetings, not even at their mother's funeral. Eamon wasn't protecting himself. He was risking everything, and not for optics. For truth. Juniper's breath fogged the glass, and her hand remained where it was, unmoving. She didn't cry, but the way her shoulders relaxed, the way her eyes softened, it was as if something inside her had been waiting for this moment all along, waiting for someone to show up and mean it, to stop hiding behind explanations, to choose the hard thing. Back on the steps, the moment hung heavy, unspoken but alive. Nayeli didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Eamon had said it for both of them. Her story wasn't being used anymore. It was being heard. Around them, the noise slowly returned. Questions, clicks, chaos. But they didn't move. They stood side by side, not as symbols, not as liars or heroes or villains, but as two people who had once built a lie and were now standing, hands empty, in the aftermath of the truth. And for the first time since this began, they weren't hiding. They were exactly where they were meant to be, seen together and real. The fallout came swiftly, and it didn't knock. It kicked the door down. Within 48 hours of Eamon's confession on the courthouse steps, the Kincaid board called an emergency vote to strip him of his CEO position. The vote wasn't personal. It never was. It was about stock prices, public relations, the illusion of stability. Sponsors backed out one by one, citing reputational risk, and statements crafted by lawyers began replacing previously loyal handshakes. Threats arrived at his office and inbox daily, some subtle, some vile, all evidence of how far people would go when their myth of moral superiority cracked. The court delayed the guardianship hearing, citing unusual public exposure and ongoing legal ambiguity. And Nayeli, now public, now exposed, was summoned by immigration officials to appear for immediate review. They didn't offer her a private room or a kind tone, just a date, a time, and the warning that any delay could result in expedited action. For a moment it felt like all the truth they had bled for had only made them more vulnerable. Like love in the light was a liability. Nayeli didn't cry. She just stood still and quiet, eyes unreadable, as Eamon reread the letter for the third time and swore he would fix this, even if it cost him what little was left. But what neither of them expected was the knock that came the next morning. Not from a lawyer, but from someone in a parka and boots, holding a worn envelope and a flyer from the vigil months ago. One of the displaced families had tracked Nayeli down, then another, then another. Within days, the church that had once held a quiet vigil for fire victims became a meeting ground for stories, testimonies, and signatures. People brought their children, their eviction notices, their unpaid medical bills, not to beg, but to speak. The mother who'd lost her apartment told reporters about Nayeli bringing her blankets after the fire. The old man who slept in his car told the court Nayeli had sat with him through an entire night, just so he wouldn't feel invisible. Even the temp worker she'd defended in the hallway months ago stood on the witness stand, tears streaking her cheeks as she said, "She changed the way I saw myself. Nobody powerful ever did that before." The courtroom grew quieter with every voice. Not because the scandal disappeared, but because the narrative shifted. Nayeli wasn't just a woman who lied, she was someone who refused to let the lie define her. And the community, the very people the system had abandoned, showed up not to judge her, but to protect her. Dash Roan, to his credit, published the story exactly as she'd asked. Not a takedown, a reckoning. His article didn't shy away from the truth. Yes, there had been a contract. Yes, there had been deception. But it framed the larger picture, the negligence that caused the fire, the way corporations use stories as shields, and the way one woman had stood up inside that machine and told the world to look closer. The story went viral, not for its scandal, but for its clarity. Suddenly, Nayeli wasn't just Kincaid's fiancée. She was a symbol of what it meant to survive with dignity. Donations came in. Not millions, but enough. Eamon, true to the words he'd spoken on the steps, began selling off assets. Not as PR, not for image. He started a relocation and support fund for the victims of the fire. When asked why, he simply said, "Because it should have been done before." The media tried to reframe it, tried to paint him as salvaging face. But people could tell the difference now. The mask was gone. What they saw was a man unlearning power, one step at a time, guided by the woman he once underestimated. The final hearing arrived like a quiet drumbeat. The courthouse was less crowded this time, but heavier somehow, the weight of resolution in the air. The judge reviewed every document, every voice, every contradiction. Then Juniper was called to testify. She walked with steady steps, her jeans torn at the knee, her hoodie oversized and slightly wrinkled, like she refused to be anything but herself. She sat, looked the judge in the eye, and said, "I don't want a perfect guardian. I want the one who learned how to be real." Her voice didn't waver. Eamon was fake for a long time, but he's not now. And I know that because Nayeli taught him how. She taught me too. What it means to feel safe, to feel seen. Her words settled like truth always does, slow and irreversible. The judge took a breath and granted Eamon permanent guardianship. Then, in a separate ruling just hours later, the court granted Nayeli a path to stay in the country legally, under a humanitarian provision supported by overwhelming community testimony. There were no cheers, no balloons, just silence, relief. A dozen people crying quietly in different corners of the room, and Nayeli, head bowed, hands shaking as she realized, for the first time in years, she wasn't going anywhere. Spring arrived gently that year. The ice began to melt. The city softened. Months after the ruling, Eamon and Nayeli returned to the church basement where the vigil once took place. But the room was transformed. The candles had been replaced with folding chairs and hand-drawn posters. Juniper's friends crowded the snack table, laughing too loudly. Music played from a borrowed speaker. There was no ceremony, no formal announcement. But Eamon reached into his coat pocket and placed something in Nayeli's palm. A ring, simple and warm. Not as a transaction, not as protection, but as a question. He didn't ask out loud. He just looked at her, giving her the silence to decide. And she didn't answer with words either. She closed her fingers around the ring and began to cry, not because she was afraid, but because it was the first time she could picture a future without needing to run toward or away from it. The people around them blurred. The noise faded. And in that small gesture, everything that had once felt broken found new shape. Juniper slipped her a note sometime later, folded into a square and placed in her coat pocket when she wasn't looking. It was written in the same careful hand Nayeli remembered from months before. She opened it in private, heart already aching, and read the words, "You're not temporary. You're family." Just that. No signature. No need. She folded it once more and placed it beside the first note she had written long ago, the one hidden in her shoe, the one with her real name. They sat side by side now, not in fear, but in proof that she had existed, that she had stayed. that she had built something that would not be taken. In that basement filled with warmth and mismatched chairs, Nayeli looked around and finally believed in something she had spent her whole life doubting. She had a home. And this time, it wasn't borrowed. It was hers. What did you think of Nayeli's decision to step into the spotlight and tell the truth, even knowing it could cost her everything? And do you believe Eamon truly redeemed himself when he chose to protect her instead of his empire? Share your thoughts in the comments. On a scale from 0 to 10, what rating would you give this story? If you want more emotional twists, fearless love, and new beginnings, subscribe to Sweet Chapters and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.